My stepmom said, "If you want to keep living here, you'll start paying rent, $2,500 a month." So I bought the house from the landlord that same day. The look on her face when I handed her the eviction notice was priceless. I, 26M, never thought I'd be the one kicking my own stepmom out of a house. But life has a funny way of turning tables when you least expect it. It started on a Tuesday evening when I came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with that smug expression she'd perfected over the years. My dad had passed away 8 months earlier, and living with her had become increasingly unbearable. She'd always treated me like an inconvenience, but after Dad died, the mask came off completely. She looked up from her phone and told me we needed to talk about my living situation. I'd been staying in the house rent-free since college, working my way up in software development while saving aggressively. Dad had always insisted I shouldn't pay rent, that family took care of family. But she had different ideas. She informed me that if I wanted to continue living there, I'd need to start paying $2,500 monthly. The number hit me like a slap. The average rent for a decent apartment in our area was around $1,500, maybe $1,800 if you wanted something nice. She wasn't asking for a fair contribution. She was trying to price me out. I asked her why such a high amount, and she said the house was expensive to maintain and she needed help with costs. I knew for a fact that Dad's life insurance had paid off a substantial chunk of their debts, and his pension was still supporting her comfortably. This wasn't about money. This was about control. Something clicked in my head right then. I'd been financially careful for years, watching every penny, investing smartly. I had a solid 6-figure sum sitting in various accounts, money I'd been planning to use for a down payment on my own place eventually. But I'd been dragging my feet because leaving felt like abandoning Dad's memory. I told her I'd think about it and went to my room. That's when I did something impulsive that would change everything. I looked up the property records online and discovered something interesting. My stepmom and Dad had never actually owned the house. They'd been renting it for the past 12 years from an elderly landlord who lived 3 states away. I spent the next few hours researching everything I could about the property. The landlord was in his late 70s, and the house had been in his family for decades. On a hunch, I tracked down his contact information and sent him an email asking if he'd ever considered selling. I explained I was a current tenant's son and had the means to make a serious cash offer. He responded within an hour. He'd been thinking about liquidating his rental properties but hadn't gotten around to it. The property taxes and maintenance from a distance were becoming burdensome. We scheduled a call for the next morning. Wednesday morning, I called in sick to work and spent 3 hours on the phone with him and his lawyer. The house was appraised at around $400,000, but he was willing to sell for $375 if we could close quickly and handle everything smoothly. I had enough for a substantial down payment, and my income was more than sufficient for the mortgage. By noon, I'd connected him with my bank and a real estate attorney I'd found online with excellent reviews. My stepmom didn't notice anything unusual. She was too busy planning what she'd do with her new rental income, probably already spending the money in her head. Thursday morning, the landlord's attorney sent over the preliminary paperwork. Everything was moving at an unusually fast pace because the landlord wanted to simplify his life before an upcoming surgery, and I was offering cash-adjacent terms that made his lawyer happy. We scheduled the inspection for Friday. I kept going to work, acting normal, while internally I was terrified this might fall through. But I checked everything. My credit was excellent, my income was verifiable, and I had no debt beyond a small car payment I'd kept just to maintain credit history. Friday evening, the inspection revealed some minor issues, but nothing deal-breaking. The landlord agreed to a small price reduction to $370, and we moved forward. My stepmom asked why I'd been so quiet lately, and I told her I was just stressed about work. She seemed satisfied with that answer. The weekend was torture. I barely slept, constantly checking my email for updates. Monday morning, my attorney called to say the landlord was eager to close as soon as possible. We scheduled it for Wednesday. Tuesday night, my stepmom brought up the rent again. She asked if I'd made a decision and reminded me that November 1st was approaching. I told her I was still considering my options, which was technically true. She said she needed an answer by Friday at the latest because if I wasn't paying, she'd need to find someone who would. That comment sealed her fate in my mind. She was planning to either force me out or turn my childhood home into some kind of boarding house situation. I realized then that she'd never cared about me or Dad's wishes. This was purely transactional for her. Wednesday afternoon, I left work early claiming a dental appointment. Instead, I met with the landlord's attorney, my attorney, and a representative from the title company at their office. The landlord appeared via video call, and we spent 2 hours signing documents. By 4 p.m., I was officially the owner of the house. The feeling was surreal. I owned property at 26. But more than that, I owned the power to correct an injustice that had been brewing since Dad died. Thursday morning, I consulted with a real estate attorney about tenant rights in our state. Since my stepmom had never had a formal lease with the landlord and had been paying month to month for years, she was legally considered a month-to-month tenant. As the new owner, I could choose not to renew her tenancy with proper notice, which in our state was 30 days. The attorney drafted an official notice of non-renewal, informing her that her tenancy would end in 30 days and she'd need to vacate. It was all perfectly legal. I wasn't evicting her for non-payment or bad behavior. I simply wasn't renewing her month-to-month agreement as the new property owner. I decided to wait until Friday evening. I wanted her to think she'd won, that she'd successfully cornered me into either paying her inflated rent or leaving. Friday arrived, and I came home from work at my usual time. She was in the living room, watching television. She looked up and asked if I'd made my decision about the rent. Her tone made it clear she expected me to either agree to her terms or tell her I'd be moving out. I sat down across from her and told her I had indeed made a decision about my living situation. She smiled that self-satisfied smile and asked what I'd decided. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying and removed 2 documents. The first was a copy of the property deed with my name on it. The second was the notice of non-renewal. I slid them across the coffee table toward her. She picked up the deed first, confusion spreading across her face as she read it. I watched as understanding slowly dawned. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened slightly. She looked at me, then back at the document, then at me again. She asked what this meant, though I could tell she already knew. I explained calmly that I'd purchased the house from the landlord and was now the legal owner. As such, I was choosing not to renew her month-to-month tenancy. She had 30 days to find new accommodation and vacate the premises. The color drained from her face. She started to stammer, asking how I could possibly afford to buy a house, claiming this couldn't be legal, insisting that Dad would never have wanted this. I reminded her that Dad had wanted me to live here rent-free, as family, but she'd decided to ignore his wishes the moment it suited her. She tried several different tactics over the next few minutes. First anger, demanding to know how I'd done this behind her back. Then disbelief, insisting I couldn't just kick her out of her home. Then manipulation, saying I was being cruel and that Dad would be ashamed of me. I let her run through all the stages before responding. I told her that this had been her home while she was married to my father, but she'd chosen to treat me like a tenant rather than family. She'd set the terms when she demanded $2,500 monthly for a house she didn't even own. I was simply playing by the rules she'd established. She asked where she was supposed to go, and I suggested she use the money she'd been planning to collect from me to find an apartment. After all, $2,500 a month should cover a nice place in the area. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She tried appealing to sentiment, talking about memories in the house and how Dad had loved this place. I agreed that he had, which was exactly why I'd bought it, to preserve his memory and keep it in the family. Real family. Over the next few days, she attempted various strategies. She called Dad's brother, my uncle, to complain about what I'd done. He called me, heard the full story, and told her she'd gotten what she deserved. She tried contacting the old landlord to complain, but his attorney informed her that the sale was final and legal. She even suggested we could work something out, that maybe she could stay if she paid me rent. I declined politely but firmly. The bridge had been burned when she'd tried to exploit me, and I wasn't interested in being her landlord. Update 1. The 30-day notice period was awkward but manageable. I'd been staying with a friend for a few days immediately after serving the papers, giving her space to process and start packing. When I returned, the atmosphere was icy but civil. She'd clearly been going through Dad's things, which bothered me until I realized she was probably looking for anything valuable she could claim. I'd already secured his important personal items, photographs, and anything with sentimental value in a storage unit before I'd even made the offer on the house. 2 weeks into the notice period, she tried a new approach. She'd been talking to other family members, and Dad's sister called me. My aunt was sympathetic but worried about the family drama this was causing. She asked if there was any way to resolve this more peacefully. I explained the entire situation from my perspective, how the rent demand had been deliberately excessive, how my stepmom had shown no consideration for Dad's wishes or my well-being, and how I'd simply taken control of my own housing situation in the only way available to me. My aunt understood but suggested I was being harsh. Maybe I was. But watching my stepmom scramble to find housing after she'd tried to price me out of my own home felt like justice, not cruelty. 3 weeks in, she found an apartment. It was smaller than she wanted and cost $1,800 monthly, which ate into her budget significantly. She made sure I knew about her displeasure, commenting loudly on phone calls about how she was being forced into a less desirable living situation by her ungrateful stepson. I reminded myself that she'd created this situation entirely on her own. The final week was surprisingly quiet. She'd packed most of her belongings, hired movers, and seemed resigned to the reality. On her last evening in the house, she asked if we could talk. We sat in the kitchen, the same place where she'd delivered her rent ultimatum. She told me she understood why I'd done what I'd done, but asked if I thought Dad would have approved. It was a low blow, invoking his memory like that. I told her honestly that Dad would have been disappointed in both of us. Disappointed in her for treating his son like a cash source rather than family, and disappointed in me for handling it the way I did rather than trying harder to work things out. But ultimately, I'd learned from watching their marriage that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. She didn't have much to say to that. She left the next morning without a goodbye, taking her belongings and closing that chapter of both our lives. Update 2. Living alone in the house was strange at first. Every room held memories of Dad, some good, some complicated. I'd grown up in this house, learned to ride a bike in the driveway, had my first heartbreak in my bedroom. Now it was entirely mine, for better or worse. I threw myself into making it feel like my space. I repainted the living room, updated some fixtures, and converted Dad's old office into a proper home workspace for my software development job. The physical changes helped mentally separate the past from the present. The family drama took longer to settle. Some relatives sided with me, understanding that I'd been backed into a corner. Others thought I'd been unnecessarily vindictive. Holidays that first year were complicated, with some gatherings deliberately excluding one or both of us to avoid confrontation. My stepmom apparently told anyone who'd listened that I'd stolen her home and left her destitute, conveniently leaving out the part where she tried to charge me nearly double market rent for a house she didn't own. The truth had a way of getting around, though, and most people eventually heard both sides. About 6 months after she moved out, I got an unexpected call from the old landlord. He wanted to know how I was doing with the house and mentioned he'd heard through mutual connections about what had happened with my stepmom. He admitted he'd suspected there was more to the story when I'd reached out so quickly to buy, but my earnestness and financial capability had convinced him I was genuine. He told me something interesting. Apparently, my stepmom had been late on rent several times over the years, and he'd been lenient only because my dad had been a good tenant otherwise. After Dad died, she'd called once asking about buying the house herself, but her financials hadn't been strong enough for him to consider it seriously. That's probably when she'd come up with the idea to charge me rent, trying to improve her own position. Knowing that context made everything make more sense. She hadn't just been cruel for cruelty's sake. She'd been desperate to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford on her own and had seen me as the solution. I found myself feeling something unexpected. Not quite forgiveness, but a kind of understanding. We'd both been trying to survive after losing Dad, just in very different ways. The financial side worked out well for me. The mortgage payment was less than rent would have been in most places, and I was building equity. My career continued progressing, and within a year, I'd been promoted twice. The stability of owning my home, ironically made possible by my stepmom's ultimatum, had given me the confidence to take bigger professional risks. I started dating someone seriously about a year after the whole situation. When I explained the story of how I'd come to own the house, she was shocked, but ultimately understood. She pointed out that while my method had been dramatic, I'd essentially just protected myself from being exploited. It was validating to hear that perspective from someone outside the family drama. Eventually, I ran into my stepmom at a grocery store. It was unavoidable in our mid-sized town. We made awkward eye contact, and for a moment, I thought she might just walk away. Instead, she approached and asked how I was doing. We had a brief, civil conversation. She mentioned her apartment was actually more manageable than the house had been, and she'd started working part-time at a bookstore. I told her about my job promotion. Neither of us mentioned the past directly, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement that we'd both moved on. She didn't apologize, and I didn't either. Maybe we both still thought we'd been right, or maybe we just recognized that apologies couldn't change what had happened anyway. It was closure of a sort, even if it wasn't the dramatic reconciliation you see in movies. Looking back now, I don't regret buying the house. I regret that the situation with my stepmom deteriorated to that point, and I sometimes wonder if I could have handled it differently. But the core action, taking control of my housing and my future, was the right move. The house isn't just a property to me anymore. It's proof that when someone tries to back you into a corner, sometimes the best response isn't to fight your way out or meekly surrender. Sometimes it's to completely change the game they're playing. Dad's memory lives on here in the way I maintain his garden, in the photos I've hung on the walls, in the life I'm building. And maybe that's what he would have wanted most. Not for his wife and son to stay trapped in a toxic situation out of obligation, but for both of us to find a way forward, even if that path looked nothing like what anyone expected.